Curious Adventure of Mr. Bond by Nugent Barker. Mr. Bond climbed from the wooded slopes of the valley into broad daylight, his Inverness cape throwing his portly figure into still greater prominence against the floor of the treetops at his back. Was torn and soiled by twigs and thorns and leaves, and he stooped with prim concern to brush off the bits and pieces. After this he eased his knapsack on his shoulder, and now he blinked his eyes upon the country stretching out before him. Far away, across the tufted surface of the tableland, there stood a house with its column of smoke lighted and still, on the verge of a forest. A house, an inn. He felt it in his very bones. His hunger returned, and became a source of gratification to him. Toiling on and pulling the brim of his hat over his eyes, he watched the ruby gleam grow bigger and brighter, and when at last he stood beneath the sign, he cried aloud, scarcely able to believe in his good fortune. "The rest of the traveller," he read, and there too ran the name of the landlord, Crispin Sasserach. The stillness of the night discouraged him, and he was afraid to tap at the curtained window, and now for the first time the full weight of his weariness fell upon the traveller. Staring into the black mouth of the porch, he imagined himself to be at rest in bed, sprawled out, abundantly sleeping, drugged into forgetfulness by a full stomach. He shut his eyes and drooped a little under his Inverness cape. But when he looked again into the entrance, there stood Crispin Sasserach, holding a lamp between their faces. Mr. Bond was plump and heavy-jawed, with sagging cheeks, and eyes that scarcely relieved the lamplight. The other face was smooth and large and oval, with small lips pressed into a smile. "Come in, the landlord whispered. "Do come in. She is cooking a lovely broth tonight." He turned and chuckled, holding the lamp above his head. Through the doorway of this lost upland inn, Mr. Bond followed the monstrous back of his host. The passage widened and became a hall. And here, amongst the shadows that were gliding from their lurking places as the lamp advanced, the landlord stopped and tilted the flat of his hand in the air, as though enjoining his guest to listen. Then Mr. Bond disturbed the silence of the house with a sniff and a sigh. Not only could he smell the lovely broth, already in the outer hall he tasted it, a complex and subtle flavour, pungent, heavy as honey, light as a web in the air, nipping him in the stomach, bringing tears into his eyes. Mr. Bond stared at Crispin Sasserach, at the shadows beyond, and back again to Crispin Sasserach. The man was standing there with his huge, oval, hairless face upturned in the light of the lamp he carried. Then, impulsively, as though reluctant to cut short such sweet anticipation, he plucked the traveller by the cape and led him to the cheerful living room, and introduced him, with a flourish of the hand, to Myrtle Sasserach, the landlord's young and small and busy wife, who at that very moment was standing at a round table of great size, beneath the massive centre-beam of the ceiling, her black hair gleaming in the light of many candles, her plump hand dipping a ladle soundlessly into a bowl of steam. On seeing the woman, whose long lashes were once more directed towards the bowl, Mr. Bond drew his chin grimly into his neckcloth and glanced from her to Crispin Sasserach, and finally he fixed his eyes on the revolutions of the ladle. In a moment, purpose fell upon the living room, and with swift and nervous gestures, the landlord seated his guest at the table, seized the ladle from his wife, plunged it into the bowl, and thrust the brimming plate into the hands of Myrtle, who began at once to walk towards the traveller, the steam of the broth rising into her grave eyes. After a muttered grace, Mr. Bond pushed out his lips as though he were whispering, "Spoon." "Oh, what a lovely broth," he murmured, catching a drip in his handkerchief. Crispin Sasserach grinned with delight. "I always say it's the best in the world." Whereupon, with a rush, he broke into peals of falsetto laughter, and blew a kiss towards his wife. A moment later, the two Sasserachs were leaving their guest to himself, bending over their own platefuls of broth, and discussing domestic affairs, as though they had no other person sitting at their table. For some time their voices were scarcely louder than the sound of the broth eating. But when the traveller's plate was empty, then, in a flash, Crispin Sasserach became again a loud and attentive host. "Now then, sir, another helping?" he suggested, picking up the ladle and beaming down into the bowl, while Myrtle left her chair and walked a second time towards the guest. Mr. Bond said that he would, and pulled his chair a little closer to the table. Into his blood and bones life had returned with twice its accustomed vigour. His very feet were as light as though he had soaked them in a bath of pine needles. "There you are, sir. Myrtle's coming. Lord Almighty, I will wish I was tasting it for the first time." Then, spreading his elbows, the landlord crouched over his own steaming plateful and chuckled again. "This broth is a wine in itself. It's a wine in itself, b'God. It staggers a man." Flushed with excitement, his oval face looked larger than ever, and his auburn hair, whirled into bellicose corkscrews, seemed to burn brighter, as though someone had brought the bellows to it. Stirred by the broth, Mr. Bond began to describe minutely his journey out of the valley. His voice grew as prosy, his words as involved, as though he were talking at home amongst his own people. "Now, let me see, where was I?" he buzzed again and again. "And later, I was very glad to see your light, I can tell you," he chuckled. Then Crispin jumped up from the table, his small mouth pouting with laughter. The evening shifted to the fireside. Fresh logs cracked like pistol shots as Crispin Sasserach dropped them into the flames. The traveller could wish for nothing better than to sit here by the hearth, talking plangently to Crispin, and slyly watching Myrtle as she cleared away the supper things, though indeed among his own people Mr. Bond was thought to hold women in low esteem. He found her downcast eyes modest and even pretty. One by one she blew the candles out. With each extinguishment she grew more ethereal, while reaping a fuller share of the pagan firelight. "Come and sit beside us now and talk," thought Mr. Bond, and presently she came. They made him very comfortable. He found a log fire burning in his bedroom, and a bowl of broth on the bedside table. "Oh, but now they're overdoing it," he cried aloud, petulantly. "They're crude, they're nothing but school children." And seizing the bowl, he emptied it onto the shaggy patch of garden beneath his window. The black wall of the forest seemed to stand within a few feet of his eyes. The room was filled with the mingled light of moon, fire, and candle. Mr. Bond, eager at last for the dreamless rest, the abandoned sleep of the traveller, turned and surveyed the room in which he was to spend the night. He saw with pleasure the four-poster bed, itself as large as a tiny room. The heavy oaken chairs and cupboards, the tall twisting candlesticks, their candles burnt halfway, no doubt, by a previous guest. The ceiling that he could touch with the flat of his hand. He touched it. In the misty morning he could see no hint of the forest, and down the shallow staircase he found the hall thick with the odour of broth. The Sasserachs were seated already at the breakfast table, like two children eager to begin the day with their favourite food. Crispin Sasserach was lifting his spoon and pouting his lips, while Myrtle was stirring her ladle around the tureen, her eyes downcast, and Mr. Bond sighed inaudibly as he saw again the woman's dark and lustrous hair. He noticed also the flawless condition of the Sasserach skin. There was not a blemish to be seen on their two faces, on their four hands. He attributed this perfection to the beneficial qualities of the broth, no less than to the upland air, and he began to discuss in his plangent voice the subject of health in general. In the middle of this discourse, Crispin Sasserach remarked excitedly that he had a brother who kept an inn a day's journey along the edge of the forest. "Oh," said Mr. Bond, pricking up his ears. "So you have a brother, have you?" "Certainly," whispered the innkeeper. "It is most convenient." Most convenient for what?" "Why, for the inns. His name's Martin. We share our guests. We help each other. The proper brotherly spirit, begot." Mr. Bond stared angrily into his broth. They share their guests. But what, he thought, has that to do with me? He said aloud, "Perhaps I'll meet him one day, Mr. Sasserach." "Today!" cried Crispin, whacking his spoon onto the table. "I'm taking you there today. But don't you worry," he added, seeing the look on the other's face, and flattering himself that he had read it aright. You'll be coming back to us, don't you worry. Day after tomorrow, day after that. One of these days. Hey, ain't that right, Mayor? Ain't that right?" he repeated, bouncing up and down in his chair like a big child. "Quite right," answered Myrtle Sasserach to Mr. Bond, whose eyes were fixed upon her with heavy attention. A moment later, the innkeeper was out of his chair, making for the hall, calling back to Myrtle to have his boots ready. In the middle of this bustle, Mr. Bond bowed stiffly to Myrtle Sasserach and found his way with dignity to the back garden that now appeared wider than he had supposed. A fenced-in plot of grass reaching above his knees and scattered with burdock, whose prickly heads clung to his clothes as he made for the gate in the fence at the foot of this wilderness. He blinked his eyes and walked on the rough turf that lay between him and the forest. By this time the sun was shining in an unclouded sky. A fine day was at hand, and Mr. Bond was sweeping his eye along the endless wall of the forest when he heard the innkeeper's voice calling to him in the stillness. "Mr. Bond! Mr. Bond!" Turning reluctantly and stepping carefully through the garden in order to avoid the burrs of the burdock, the traveller found Crispin Sasserach on the point of departure, in a great bustle, with a strong horse harnessed to a two-wheeled cart, and his wife putting up her face to be kissed. "Yes, I'll go with you," cried Mr. Bond, but the Sasserachs did not appear to hear him. He lingered for a moment in the porch, scowling at Myrtle's back, scowling at the large young horse that seemed to toss its head at him with almost human insolence. Then he sighed, and slinging his knapsack over his shoulder, sat himself beside the driver. The horse was uncommonly large, restless between the shafts, and in perfect fettle. and without a word from Crispin, the animal began to plunge forward rapidly over the worn track. For some time the two men drove in silence on the second stage of Mr. Bond's adventure above the valley. The traveller sat up stiffly, inflating his lungs methodically, glaring through his small eyes, and forcing back his shoulders. Presently he began to talk about the mountain air, and received no answer. On his right hand the wall of the forest extended as far as his eyes could see, while on his left hand ran the brink of the valley, a mile away, broken here and there by rowan trees. The monotony of the landscape, and the continued silence of the innkeeper, soon began to pall on Mr. Bond, who liked talking, and was seldom at ease unless his eyes were busy picking out new things. Even the horse behaved with the soundless regularity of a machine, so that, besides the traveller, only the sky showed a struggle to make progress. Clouds came from nowhere, shaped and broke, and at midday the sun in full swing was riding between white puffs of cloud, glistening by fits and starts on the moist coat of the horse. The forest beneath, and the stretch of coarse grass running to the valley, were constantly shining and darkening. Yet Crispin Sasserach never opened his mouth, even to a whisper, though sometimes, between his teeth, he spat soundlessly over the edge of the cart. The landlord had brought with him a casserole of the broth, and during one of these sunny breaks, he pulled up the horse without a word and poured the liquor into 2 pannikins, which he proceeded to heat patiently over a spirit stove. In the failing light of the afternoon, when the horse was still making its top speed, when Crispin Sasserach was buzzing fitfully between his teeth, and sleep was flirting with the traveller, a shape appeared obscurely on the track ahead, and with it came the growing jingle of bells. Mr. Bond sat up and stared. He had not expected to meet in such a god-forsaken spot another cart or carriage. He saw at length approaching him a 4-wheeled buggy, drawn by 2 sprightly horses in tandem. A thin-faced man in breeches and a bowler hat was driving it. The 2 drivers greeted each other solemnly, raised their whips, but never slackened speed. "Well, who was that?" asked Mr. Bond after a pause. "My brother Martin's manservant." "Where is he going?" asked Mr. Bond. "To the rest of the traveller, with news." "Indeed? What news?" persisted Mr. Bond. The landlord turned his head. "News for my myrtle," he whispered, winking at the traveller. Mr. Bond shrugged his shoulders. What is the use of talking to such a bore, he thought, and fell once more into his doze. The harvest moon climbed up again, whitening the earth, while now and then the landlord spat towards the forest, and never spoke another word until he came to Martin Sasserach's. Then Crispin leapt to life. "Out with you!" he cried. "Psst, Mr. Bond, wake up! Get out at once! We've reached the Headless Man, sir." Mr. Bond, staggered by so much energy, flopped to the ground. His head felt as large as the moon. He heard the horse panting softly, and saw the breath from its nostrils flickering upwards in the cold air, while the white-faced Crispin Sasserach was leaping about under the moon, whistling between his teeth and calling out enthusiastically, "Martin! Martin! Here he is!" The sheer wall of forest echoed back the name. Indeed, the whole of the moonlight seemed to be filled with the name Martin, and Mr. Bond had a fierce desire to see this Martin Sasserach, whose sign was hanging high above the traveller's head. After repeated calls from Crispin, the landlord of the Headless Man appeared, and Mr. Bond, expecting a very giant in physical stature, was shocked to see the small and bespectacled figure that had emerged from the house. Crispin Sasserach grew quick and calm in a moment. "Meet again?" he whispered to Mr. Bond, shutting his eyes and stretching his small mouth as though in ecstasy. Then he gave the traveller a push towards the approaching Martin, and a moment later he was in his cart, and the horse was springing its way back to the rest of the traveller. Mr. Bond stood where he was, listening to the dying sound of the horse, and watching the landlord of the Headless Man, and presently he was staring at two grey, flickering eyes behind the landlord's glasses. "Anyone arriving at my inn from my brother's is trebly welcome. He is welcome not only for Crispin's own sake and mine, but also for the sake of our brother Stephen." The voice was as quiet and as clear as the moonlight, and the speaker began to return to his inn, with scarcely a pause between speech and movement. Mr. Bond examined curiously the strongly lighted hall, that in shape and size was the very double of Crispin's. Oil lamps, gracefully columned, gleamed almost as brightly from their fluted silver surfaces as from their opal-lighted heads. And there was Martin, stooping up the very stairs, it seemed, that Mr. Bond had walked at Crispin Sasserach's. A scanty man, this brother, throwing out monstrous shadows, turning once to peer back at his guest, and standing at last in a bright and airy bedroom, where, the courteous words from which his eyes, lost in thought and gently flickering, seemed to be far distant. He invited his guest to wash before dining. Martin Sasserach fed Mr. Bond delicately on that evening of his arrival, presenting him with small cold dishes of various kinds, and always exquisitely cooked and garnished. And these, together with the almost crystalline cleanliness of the room and of the table, seemed appropriate to the chemist-like appearance of the host. A bottle of wine was opened for Mr. Bond, who among his own people was known to drink nothing headier than bottled cider. During dinner the wine warmed up a brief moment of attention in Martin Sasserach. He peered with sudden interest at his guest. "The Headless Man. There is, in fact, a story connected with that name, if you can call it a story." He smiled briefly, tapping his finger, and a moment later was examining an ivory piece, elaborately carved, that held the bill of fare. "Lovely, lovely, isn't it? In fact, there are many stories," he ended, as though the number of stories excused him from wasting his thought over the recital of merely one. Soon after dinner he retired, alluding distantly to work from which he never liked to be away long. Mr. Bond went to bed early that night, suffering from dyspepsia, and glowering at the absence of home comforts in his bright and efficient bedroom. The birds awakened him to a brisk autumnal morning. Breathing heavily, he told himself that he was always very fond of birds and trees and flowers, and soon he was walking sleepily in Martin Sasserach's garden. The trimness of the beds began to please him. He followed the right-angled paths with dignified obesity. His very bones were proud to be alive. A green gate at the garden foot attracted Mr. Bond's attention, but knowing that it would lead him on to the wild grass beyond, and thence to the forest, whose motionless crest could be seen all this while over the privet hedge, he chose to linger where he was, sniffing the clear scent of the flowers, and losing with every breath and step another whiff of Crispin's broth, to his intense delight. Hunger drew him back into the house at last, and he began to pace the twilit rooms. Martin Sasserach, he saw, was very fond of ivory. He stooped and peered at the delicate things, ivory objects of every description, perfectly carved. Paper knives, elves, chessmen, salad spoons, tiny busts and faces, often of grotesque appearance, and even delicate boxes, fretted from ivory. The echo of his feet on the polished floors intensified the silence of the Headless Man, yet even this indoor hush was full of sound when compared with the stillness of the scene beyond the uncurtained windows. The tufted grass was not yet lighted by the direct rays of the sun. The traveller stared towards the rowan trees that stood on the brink of the valley. Beyond them stretched a carpet of mist, raising the rest of the world to the height of the plateau. And Mr. Bond, recalling the house and town that he had left behind him, began to wonder whether he was glad or sorry that his adventures had brought him to this lost region. "Cold enough for my cape," he shivered, fetching it from the hall and hurrying out of the inn. The desire had seized him to walk on the tufted grass, to foot it as far as the trees, and he had indeed gone some distance on his journey, wrapped in his thoughts and antique Inverness cape, when the note of a gong came up behind him, like a thread waving on the air. "Hark at that," he whispered, staring hard at the ragged line of rowan trees on which his heart was set. Then he shrugged his shoulders and turned back to the Headless Man, where his host was standing, lost in thought at the breakfast table that still held the crumbs of the night before. "Ah, yes, it's you. You slept well." "Tolerably well," said Mr. Bond. "We breakfast rather early here. It makes a longer day. Stennett will be back later. He's gone to my brother Crispin's." "With news?" said Mr. Bond. Martin Sasserach bowed courteously, though a trifle stiffly. He motioned his guest towards a chair at the table. Breakfast was cold and short and silent. Words were delicate things to rear in this crystalline atmosphere. Martin's skin sagged and was the colour of old ivory. Now and then he looked up at his guest. His grey eyes focused beyond mere externals, and it seemed as though they lodged themselves in Mr. Bond's very bones. On one of these occasions, the traveller made great play with his appetite. It's all this upland air," he asserted, thumping his chest. The sun began to rise above the plateau. Again the landlord vanished, murmuring his excuses. Silence flooded the Headless Man. The garden purred in full blaze of the sun that now stood higher than the forest, and the gravelled paths crunched slowly beneath Mr. Bond's feet. "News for Myrtle," he pondered, letting his thoughts stray back over his journey, and frequently he drifted through the house, where all was still and spacious. Dusty, museum-like rooms, brimming with sunlight, while everywhere those ivory carvings caught his eye, possessing his sight as completely as the taste of Crispin's broth had lodged in his very lungs. Lunch was yet another meal of cold food and silence, broken only by coffee that the landlord heated on a spirit stove at the end of the table, and by a question from the traveller, to which this thin-haired Martin, delicately flicking certain greyish dust off the front of his coat and sleeve, replied that he had been a collector of carvings for years past, and was continually adding to his collection. His voice drew out in length, and seemed, in fact, to trail him from the sunlit dining room, back to his everlasting work. And now the afternoon itself began to drag, and presently to settle down in the sun as though the whole of time was dozing. "Here's my indigestion back again," sighed Mr. Bond, mooning about. At home he would have rested in his bedroom, with its pink curtains and flowered wallpaper. He crept into the garden and eyed the back of the house. Which of those windows in the trimly creepered stone lit up the landlord and his work? He listened for the whirring of a lathe, the scraping of a knife, and wondered, startled, why he had expected to hear such things. He felt the forest behind his back, and turned and saw it looming above the privet hedge. Impulsively he started to cross the sun-swept grass beyond the gate, but within a few yards of the forest his courage failed him again. He could not face the wall of trees, and with a cry he fled into the house and seized his Inverness. His eyes looked far beyond the rowans on the skyline as he plodded over the tufted grass. Already he could see himself down there below, counties and counties away, on the valley level, in the house of his neighbours, the Allcarts, drinking their coffee or tea, and telling them of his adventures, and especially of this adventure. It was not often that a man of his age and secure position in the world went off alone in search of joy or trouble. He scanned the distant line of rowan trees, and nodded, harking back. As far as it has gone, I'll tell them this adventure, as far as it ever went. And he would say to them, the things I might have seen if I had stayed. Yes, Hawkard, I was very glad to climb down into the valley that day, I can tell you. I don't mind admitting I was a bit frightened. The tippet of his cape caressed his shoulders, like the hand of a friend. Mr. Bond was not yet half away to the rowan trees when, looking back, he saw against the darkness of the forest wall a carriage rapidly approaching the Headless Man. At once there flashed into his memory the eyes of the manservant Stennet, who went between the Sasserach inns. He knew that Stennet's eyes were on him now. The sound of the horse's feet was coming up to him like a soft ball bouncing over the grass. Mr. Bond shrugged his shoulders and stroked his pendulous cheeks. Already he was on his way back to the Headless Man, conscious that 2 flying horses could have overtaken him long before he reached the rowans. But why, he thought, holding himself with dignity, should I imagine that these people are expecting me to run away? And why that sudden panic in the garden? It's all that deathly quietness of the morning getting on my nerves. The carriage had disappeared some time before he reached the inn, over whose tiled and weather-stained roof the redness of the evening was beginning to settle. And now the traveller was conscious of a welcome that seemed to run out and meet him at the very door. He found a log fire crackling in the dining room, and Mr. Bond, holding his hands to the blaze, felt suddenly at ease and weary. He had intended to assert himself, to shout for Martin Sasserach, to demand that he be escorted down at once from the plateau. But now he wished for nothing better than to stand in front of the fire, waiting for Stennet to bring him tea. A man began to sing in the heart of the house. Stennet? The fellow's eyes and hawk-like nose were suddenly visible in the fire. The singing voice grew louder, died at length discreetly into silence, and the tread of footsteps in the hall. And again the traveller was listening to the flames as they roared in the chimney. "Let me take your coat, sir," Stennet said. Then Mr. Bond whipped round, his cheeks shaking with anger. Why did they want to force this hospitality upon him, making him feel like a prisoner? He glared at the large checked riding breeches, at the muscular shoulders, at the face that seemed to have grown the sharper through swift driving. He almost shouted, "Where's that bowler hat?" Fear? Perhaps. But if fear had clutched him for a moment, it had left him now. He knew that the voice had pleased him, a voice of deference breaking into the cold and irreverent silence of the Headless Man. The cape was already off his shoulders, hanging on Stennet's bent and respectful arm. And God be praised, the voice was announcing that tea would be ready soon. He and Stennet stood there, confidentially plotting. "China?" Yes, sir. We have china, Stennet said. And buttered toast, said Mr. Bond, softly rubbing his chin. Some time after tea he was awakened from his doze by the hand of the manservant, who told him that a can of boiling water was waiting in his room. Mr. Bond felt that dinner would be a rich meal that night, and it was. He blushed as the dishes were put before him. Hare soup. How did they know his favourite soup? Through entree, remove and roast, his hands, soft and pink from washing, were busier than they had been for days. The chicken was braised to a turn. Oh, what mushrooms au gratin! The partridge brought tears to his eyes. The Saxony pudding caused him to turn again to Martin in Stennet's praise. The landlord bowed with distant courtesy. "A game of chess," he suggested when dinner was over. "My last opponent was a man like yourself, a traveller making a tour of the inns. We started a game. He is gone from us now. Perhaps you will take his place," smiled Martin Sasserach, his precise voice dropping and seeming to transmit its flow of action to the thin hand poised above the board. "My move," he whispered, playing at once. He had thought it out for a week. But although Mr. Bond tried to sink his thoughts into the problem so suddenly placed before him, he could not take them off his after-dinner dyspepsia, and with apologies and groans he scraped back his chair. "I'm sorry for that," smiled Martin, and his eyes flickered over the board. "I'm very sorry. Another night. Undoubtedly. With your kind help. Another night." The prospect of another day at the Headless Man was at once disturbing and pleasant to Mr. Bond as he went wheezing up to bed. "Ah, Stennet, do you ever suffer from dyspepsia?" he asked mournfully, seeing the man at the head of the staircase. Stennet snapped his fingers and was off downstairs in a moment, and a minute later he was standing at the traveller's door with a bowl of Crispin's famous broth. "Oh, that!" cried Mr. Bond, staring down at the bowl. Then he remembered its fine effect on his indigestion at Crispin's. And when at last he pulled the sheets over his head, he fell asleep in comfort and did not wake until the morning. At breakfast, Martin Sasserach looked up from his plate. "This afternoon," he murmured, "Stennets will be driving you to my brother Stephen's." Mr. Bond opened his eyes. "Another inn? Another of you Sasserachs?" "Crispin, Martin, Stephen, just the three of us. The perfect number, if you come to think of it." The traveller strode into the garden. Asters glowed in the lustreless light of the morning. By 10 o'clock the sun was shining again, when by midday a summer heat lay on the plateau, penetrating even into Mr. Bond's room. The silence of the forest pulled him to the window, made him lift up his head and shut his eyes upon that monstrous mass of trees. Fear was trying to overpower him. He did not want to go to Stephen Sasserach's, but the hours were running past him quickly now. The stillness was gone from the inn. At lunch, to which his host contributed a flow of gentle talk, the traveller felt rising within him an impatience to be off on the third stage of his journey, if such a stage must be. He jumped up from his chair without apology, and strode into the garden. The asters were now shining dimly in the strong sunlight. He opened the gate in the privet hedge, and walked onto the tufted grass that lay between it and the forest. As he did so, he heard the flap of a wing behind him, and saw a pigeon flying from a window in the roof. The bird flew over his head and over the forest, and out of sight. And for the first time he remembered seeing a pigeon taking a similar course when he was standing in the garden at Crispin's inn. His thoughts were still following the pigeon over the boundless floor of treetops, when he heard a voice calling to him in the silence. "Mr. Bond! Mr. Bond!" He walked at once to the gate and down the garden and into the house, put on his Inverness, and hitched his knapsack onto his shoulder, and in a short while he was perched beside Stennet in the flying buggy, staring at the ears of the two horses, and remembering that Martin, at the last moment, instead of bidding his guest goodbye, had gone back to his work. Although he never lost his fear of Stennet, Mr. Bond found Martin's man a good companion on a journey, always ready to speak when spoken to, and even able to arouse the traveller's curiosity at times at the monotonous landscape. "See those rowans over there?" said Stennet, nodding to the left. "Those rowans belong to Mr. Martin. He owns them halfway to Mr. Crispin's place, and halfway on to Mr. Stephen's. And so it is with Mr. Crispin and Mr. Stephen in their turn." "And what about the forest?" "Same again," said Stennet, waving his hand towards the right. "It's round, you know, and they each own a third, like a huge slice of cake." He clicked his tongue, and the horses pricked up their ears, though on either side of the dashboard the performance was no more than a formality. So swiftly was the buggy moving. "Very much quicker than Crispin's cart," gasped the passenger, feeling the wind against his face. Yet when the evening of the autumn day was closing in, he looked about him with surprise. He saw the moon rise up above the valley. Later still, he asked for information regarding the names of the 3 inns, and Stennet laughed. "The gentlemen are mighty proud of them, I can tell you. Romantic and a bit fearsome, that's what I call them. Poetical, too. They don't say the traveller's rest, but the rest of the traveller, mind you. Well, that's poetical. I don't think it was Mr. Crispin's idea. I think it was Mr. Martin's, or Mrs. Crispin's. They're the clever ones. The Headless Man is merely grim. A grim turn of mind, Mr. Martin has. And it means, of course, no more than it says. A man without a head. And then again," continued Stennet, whistling to his horses, whose backs were gleaming in the moonlight, "the inn you go into now, the Traveller's Head, well, inns are called the King's Head sometimes, aren't they, in the King's honour. Mr. Stephen goes one better than that. He dedicates his inn to the traveller himself." By this time a spark of light had become visible in the distance, and Mr. Bond fixed his eyes upon it. Once, for a moment, the spark went out, and he imagined that Stephen's head had passed in front of the living-room lamp. At this picture, anger seized him, and he wondered, amazed, why he was submitting so tamely to the commands, he could call them no less, of these oddly hospitable brothers. Fanned by his rage, the spark grew steadily bigger and brighter, until at last it had achieved the shape and size of a glowing window, through which a man's face was grinning into the moonshine. "Look here, what's all this?" cried Mr. Bond, sliding to his feet. "The Traveller's Head, sir," answered Stennet, pointing aloft. They both stared up at the sign above their heads. Then Mr. Bond scanned the sprawling mass of the inn and scowled at its surroundings. The night was still and vibrant, without sound. The endless forest stood like a wall of blue-white dust, and the traveller was about to raise his voice in wrath against the brothers Sasserach, when a commotion burst from the porch of the inn, and onto the moon-drenched grass there strode a tall and ungainly figure, swinging its arms, with a pack of creatures flopping and stumbling at its heels. "Here is Mr. Stephen," Stennet whispered, watching the approach. The landlord of the Traveller's Head was smiling pleasantly, baring his intense, white teeth, and when he had reached the traveller, he touched his forehead with a gesture that was at once respectful and overbearing. "Mr. Bond, sir." Mr. Bond muttered and bowed and stared down at the landlord's children, large-headed, large-bellied, primitive creatures, flopping round their father and pulling the skirts of the Inverness cape. Father and children gathered round the traveller, who, lost within this little crowd, soon found himself at the entrance of the traveller's head, through which his new host urged him by the arm, while two of the children pushed between them and ran ahead clumsily into the depths of the hall. The place was ill-lighted and ill-ventilated, and although Mr. Bond knew from experience exactly where the living room would be situated, yet after he had passed through its doorway, he found no further resemblance to those rooms in which he had spent 2 stages of a curious adventure. The oil lamp, standing in the middle of the round centre table, was without a shade. A moth was plunging audibly at the blackened chimney, hurling swift shadows everywhere over the ceiling and figured wallpaper, while with the return of the children, a harmonium had started fitfully to grunt and blow. "Let me take your cloak, your cape, Mr. Bond, sir," the landlord said, and spread it with surprising care on one of the vast sofas that looked the larger because of their broken springs and the stuffing that protruded through their soiled covers. But at once the children seized upon the cape, and would have torn it to pieces had not Mr. Bond snatched it from them. At this they cowered away from the stranger, fixing him with their eyes. Amidst this congestion of people and furniture, Stephen Sasserach smiled and moved continuously, a stooping giant whom none but Mr. Bond obeyed. Here was the type of man whose appearance the traveller likened to that of the old-time executioner, the axeman of the Middle Ages, harsh, loyal, simple, excessively domesticated, with a bulging forehead and untidy eyebrows, and arms muscled and ready for deeds. Stephen kept no order in his house. Noise was everywhere, yet little seemed to be done. The children called their father Steve, and put out their tongues at him. They themselves were unlovely things, and their inner natures seemed to ooze through their skins and form a surface from which the traveller recoiled. 3 of their names were familiar to Mr. Bond. Here were Crispin and Martin and Stephen over again, while Dorcas and Lydia were sisters, whose only virtue was their mutual devotion. The food at the traveller's head was homely and palatable, and Stephen the father cooked it and served it liberally on chipped plates. He sat in his soiled blue shirt, his knotted arms looking richly sunburnt against the blue. He was never inarticulate, and this surprised Mr. Bond. On the contrary, he spoke rapidly and almost as if to himself, in a low, rugged voice that was always a pleasure to hear. At moments he dropped into silence, his eyes shut, his eyebrows lowered, and his bulging forehead grew still more shiny with thought. On such occasions, Dorcas and Lydia would steal to the harmonium, while, backed by a wail from the instrument, Crispin the younger and Martin the younger would jump from the sofas onto the floor. Rousing himself at last, Stephen the elder thumped his fist on the table and turned in his chair to shout at the children. "Get along with you little devils! Get out your board and practice, you little devils!" Whereupon the children erected a huge board, punctured with holes, and each child began to hurl wooden balls through the holes and into the pockets behind them with astonishing accuracy, except for Dorcas and Lydia, and presently their father reminded them, "The moon is shining." At once the children scuttled out of the room, and Mr. Bond never saw them again. The noise and the figured wallpaper, and the fat moth beating itself against the only source of light, had caused the traveller's head to grow heavy with sleep, And now it grew heavier still as he sat by the fire with Stephen after supper was over, listening to the talk of that strangely attractive man in the soiled blue shirt. "You fond of children, Mr. Bond, sir?" Mr. Bond nodded. "Children and animals," he murmured, drowsily. "Want us to let them have their way?" sighed Stephen Sasserach. The rugged voice came clearly and soothingly into Mr. Bond's ears, until at last it shot up, vigorously, and ordered the guest to bed. Mr. Bond pulled himself out of his chair, smiled and said good night, and the moth flew into his face. Where were the children, he wondered, and their voices could not be heard? Perhaps they had fallen asleep suddenly, like animals, but Mr. Bond found it difficult to imagine those eyes in bed, asleep. Lying some minutes later in his own massive bed in this third of the Sasserach inns, with an extinguished candle on his bedside table, and gazing towards the open window from which he had drawn apart one of the heavy embroidered curtains, Mr. Bond fancied that he could hear faint cries of triumph and sounds of knocking coming from the direction of the forest. Starting up into complete wakefulness, he went to the window and stared at the forest beyond the tufted grass. The sounds, he fancied, putting his hand to his ear, were as those given forth by the children during their game, but louder, as though the game were bigger. Perhaps strange animals were uttering them. Whatever their origin, they were coming from that depth of trees whose stillness was deepened by the light of the moon. "Oh God," thought Mr. Bond, "I'm sick to death of the moonlight." And with a sweep of the arm he closed the curtains, yet could not shut out the sounds of the forest, nor the sight of the frosted grass beneath the moon. Together, sound and sight filled him with foreboding, and his cheeks shook as he groped for the unlighted candle. He must fetch his Inverness from below, fetch it at once, and get away while there was time. He found his host still sitting by the lamp in the living room. Stephen's fist, lying on the table, was closed. He opened it, and out flew the moth. "He thinks he has got away," cried Stephen, looking up and baring his teeth in a smile. "But he hasn't. He never will." "I've come for my Inverness," said Mr. Bond. It was lying on one of the massive sofas. The fire was out, and the air chilly, and the depth of the room lay in darkness. An idea crossed the mind of Mr. Bond. He said, lifting up the cape, "I thought I'd like it on my bed." And he shivered to show how cold he was. From one of the folds, the moth flew out and whirled round the room like a mad thing. "That's all right, Mr. Bond, sir. That's all right." The man had fallen into a mood of abstraction. His forehead shone in the rays of the lamp, and the traveller left the room, holding himself with dignity in his gay dressing-gown, the Inverness hanging on his arm. He was about to climb the staircase when a voice spoke softly in his ear and wished him good night. Stennet! What was that man doing here? Mr. Bond lifted his candle and gazed in astonishment at the back of Martin's manservant. The figure passed into the shadows, and the soft and deliberate ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall deepened the silence and fear of the moments that followed. Mr. Bond ran to his room, locked himself in, and began to dress. His dyspepsia had seized him again. If only he were back at Crispin's. He parted the curtains and peeped at the night. The shadow of the inn lay on the yard, and the tufted grass beyond, and one of the chimneys, immensely distorted, extended as far as the forest. The The forest wall itself was solid with moonlight. From behind it there came no longer the sounds of the knocking, and the silence set Mr. Bond trembling again. "I shall escape at dawn," he whispered, "when the moon's gone down." Feeling no longer sleepy, he took from his knapsack a volume of Mungo Park, and, fully dressed, settled himself in an easy chair, with the curtains drawn again across the window, and the candle burning close beside him. At intervals he looked up from his book, frowning, running his eye over the group of 3 pagodas in pale red, endlessly repeated on the wallpaper. The restful picture made him drowsy, and presently he slept and snored, and the candle burned on. At midnight he was awakened by crashing blows on his door. The very candle seemed to be jumping with fear, and Mr. Bond sprang up in alarm. "Yes! Who's that?" he called out feebly. "What in the name of God is that?" he whispered, as the blows grew louder. "What are they up to now?" he asked aloud, with rising terror. A splinter flew into the room, and he knew in a flash that the end of his journey had come. Was it Stephen or Stennet behind the door? The candle flickered as he blundered to and fro. He had no time to think, no time to act. He stood and watched the corner of the axe blade working in the crack in the panel. "Save me! Save me!" he whispered, wringing his hands. They fluttered towards his Inverness and struggled to push themselves into the obstinate sleeves. "Oh, come on," he whimpered, jerking his arms about, anger rising with terror. The whole room shuddered beneath the axe. He plunged at the candle and blew it out. In the darkness, a ray of light shot through a crack in the door and fell on the window curtain. Mr. Bond remembered the creeper clinging beneath his window, and as soon as possible he was floundering, scrambling, slipping down to the house-shadowed garden below. Puffing out his cheeks, he hurried onward, while the thuds of the axe grew fainter in his ears. Brickbats lay in his path, a zinc tub wrenched at his cape and ripped it loudly, an iron hoop caught in his foot, and he tottered forward with outstretched hands. And now, still running in the far-flung shadow of the house, he was on the tufted grass, whimpering a little, struggling against desire to look back over his shoulder, making for the forest that lay in the full beams of the moonlight. He tried to think, and could think of nothing but the size and safety of the shadow on which he was running. He reached the roof of the inn at last, plunged aside from his course of flight, and now he was running up the monstrous shadow of the chimney, thinking of nothing at all, because the forest stood so near. Blindingly, a moon-filled avenue stretched before him. The chimney entered the chasm and stopped, and it was as though Mr. Bond were a puff of smoke blowing into the forest depths. His shadow, swinging its monstrously distorted garments, led him to an open space at the end of the avenue. The thick-set trees encircled it with silence deeper than any Mr. Bond had known. Here, in this glade, hung silence within a silence. Yet, halting abruptly, and pressing the flat of his hands to his ribs in the pain of his sudden burst of breathing, Mr. Bond had no ears for the silence, nor eyes for anything beyond the scene that faced him in the centre of the forest glade. A group of upright posts or stakes set in a concave semicircle, throwing long shadows and bearing on each summit a human skull. "The traveller's head, the Headless Man," he whispered, stricken with terror, whipping his back on the skulls, and There was Stephen Sasserach in silhouette, leaping up the avenue, brandishing his axe, as though he were a demented woodcutter coming to cut down trees. The traveller's mind continued to run swiftly through the names of the 3 inns. The traveller's head, he thought. The headless man, the rest of the traveller. He remembered the carrier pigeons that had flown ahead of him from inn to inn. He remembered the dust on the front of Martin's coat. He was staring at the figure in the soiled blue shirt. It had halted now, as still as a tree, on the verge of the moon-filled glade. But the whirling thoughts of Mr. Bond were on the verge of light more blinding than this. They stopped, appalled, and the traveller fled beyond the skulls, fruitlessly searching for cover in the farthest wall of trees. Then Stephen sprang in his wake, flinging up a cry that went knocking against the tree trunks. The echoes were echoed by Mr. Bond, who, whipping round to face his enemy, was wriggling and jerking in his Inverness cape, slipping it off at last and swinging it in his hand, for his blood was up. And now he was deep in mortal combat, wielding his Inverness as the gladiators used to wield their nets in the old arenas. Time and time again, the axe and cape engaged each other, the one warding and hindering, the other catching and ripping clumsily enough as though in sport. Around the skulls the 2 men fought and panted, now in darkness, now in the full light pouring down the avenue. Their moon-cast shadows fought another fight together, wilder still than theirs. Then Stephen cried, "Enough of this!" and bared his teeth for the first time since the strife had started. But you're my friend," bleated Mr. Bond, and he stared at the shining thread of the axe. "The best you ever had, sir, Mr. Bond, sir," answered Stephen Sasserach, and stepping back, the landlord of the traveller's head cut off the traveller's head. The thump of the head on the sticks and leaves and grass of the forest glade was the first sound in the new and peaceful life of Mr. Bond, and he did not hear it. But to the brothers Sasserach it was a promise of life itself, a signal that all was ready now for them to apply their respective talents, busily and happily in the immediate future. Stephen took the head of Mr. Bond, and with gentle, though rather clumsy fingers, pared it to a skull, grinning back at it with simple satisfaction when the deed was over. And after that he set it up as a fine mark for his brood of primitives, the game's endeavour being to see who could throw the ball into the eye sockets. And to his brother Martin, landlord of the Headless Man, he sent the Headless Man under the care of Stennet, and Martin, on a soft autumnal day, reduced the headless body to a skeleton, with all its troubles gone. And through the days and nights he sat at work with swift precision in his fingers, carving and turning, powdering his coat with dust, creating his figures and trinkets, his paper knives and salad spoons and fretted boxes, and rare chessmen. And to his brother Crispin, landlord of the rest of the traveller, Martin sent the rest of the traveller, the soft and yielding parts, the scraps, the odds and ends, the miscellaneous pieces, all the internal lumber that had gone to fill the skin of the man from the Midlands, and to help to render him in middle years a prey to dyspepsia. Crispin received the parcel with a pursing of his small mouth, and a call to Myrtle in his clear falsetto. "Stennet's here," she answered from the kitchen. "Thank you, Chris." Her hands were soft and swollen as she scoured the tureen. The back of the inn was full of reflected sunlight, and her dark hair shone. "It's too late in the season now," she said when tea time came. "I don't suppose we'll have another one before the spring." Yet she was wrong. That very evening, when the moon had risen from beyond the valley, Myrtle murmured, "There he comes," and continued to stir her ladle in the bowl. Her husband strolled into the hall and wound the clock. He took the lamp from its bracket on the wall. He went to the door and flung it open to the moonlight, holding the lamp above his head. "Come in," he said to the stranger standing there. "She's cooking a lovely broth tonight." Today's story was The Curious Adventure of Mr. Bond by Nugent Barker. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. Well, I do hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, sweet dreams